In addition, Nasser's industrialization program had converted arable land into manufacturing space, with the consequence that Egypt was now reliant on imported grain. The Soviet Union, the funder of Nasser's grandest domestic projects, soon proved more mercenary than ally Khrushchev's fall in 1964 had precipitated a new, hard-nosed approach under Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, and Nikolai Podgorny. Already by 1966, economic aid was drying up, as was Soviet cooperativeness. Soviet leaders began advocating Egyptian austerity policies. In May 1966, Kosygin denied a request from Cairo to postpone its debt repayment. The Soviet Union would maintain its influence as an arms supplier and occasional financier but ceased to be Egypt's great power benefactor. In June 1967, the Egyptian leader broke off relations with the United States over its military aid to Israel. By 1970, the Soviets had stopped responding to Nasser's appeals for aid, loans, and debt relief. In pursuit of Pan-Arabism, Nasser had brought about Egypt's isolation. Sadat's perspective. Even at its height, the friendship between Egypt and the Soviet Union had been formal to the point of coldness. Sadat witnessed firsthand Soviet disdain for what they considered Egyptian dependency. In June 1961, while serving as Speaker of Egypt's National Assembly, he was hosted in Moscow by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Over dinner, Khrushchev reportedly told Sadat, "We can hardly have confidence in your Nasser when he is losing his grip on the country and not solving his country's problems." Sadat left the dinner immediately and departed Moscow without a farewell to his hosts. For another 9 years, as Sadat watched Nasser simultaneously rely on, and be put off by, the Soviets, he became convinced that alignment with them was disastrous. On September 28, 1970, 3 months after a final, ineffectual plea to Moscow for greater assistance, Nasser suffered a heart attack and died. In his memoirs, Sadat quotes Zhou Enlai, the premier of the People's Republic of China, telling him that the Russians had caused the collapse of Nasser's health. Sadat himself was sure that their abuse had hastened the end. It was undoubtedly one important reason why his morale deteriorated and so precipitated a terminal heart condition and diabetes. How and when a man dies is, of course, preordained by God, but Zhou was right. Nasser had believed that Egypt lay at the overlap of 3 circles, the Arab, the Islamic and the African, and perceived a shared destiny with the Arab world as a whole. He considered it his mission to liberate the Arab world from the yoke of colonialism. He regarded Arab unity as the essential first step, the defeat of 1948 by Israel having demonstrated the risks of Arab countries acting alone, and saw himself as their unifier and charismatic leader. But if 1948 was Nasser's formative conflict, 1967 was Sadat's. To him, the Six-Day War had illustrated the danger of placing pan-Arab solidarity above the national interest. For his part, Sadat felt the pull of the Mediterranean, and desired Egypt's full initiation into the world system. A high degree of engagement in the Arab world was a tactical obligation but not a civilizational one. In Egypt's long history, Arab ties were one of many influences. Proposals of Pan-Arabism could therefore be judged on their immediate practical merits. Nasser's death came just days after his attempt to paper over Arab divisions between Jordan's King Hussein and Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which in September 1970 had hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and had attempted to overthrow Hussein, who in turn evicted the PLO. Even without attributing Nasser's death to the strain of these efforts, Sadat could see that Nasser had cornered himself. Breaking relations with the United States after 1967 had made Egypt solely dependent on Soviet aid. In Sadat's evolving view, alignment with the Soviet Union had brought few rewards and the freezing of Egypt's position. But any future alignment with the United States would have to be compatible with Egypt's autonomy. Even before Nasser's death, Sadat started to act on his instincts. As Nasser tilted toward the Soviets, Sadat approached the United States with statements based on straightforward calculations of the national interest. In 1959, he told the U.S. ambassador to Egypt that the American and Egyptian positions in Africa ought to be viewed as compatible. In 1962 and 1963, as Egypt waded into Yemen on the side of an army-led insurrection against the ruling imam, Sadat kept in contact with Washington, urging the United States not to intervene on the side of the royalists. His purpose was to avoid direct conflict between the United States and Egypt. But by 1964, despite these efforts, relations between Egypt and the United States had become outright hostile, strained over the Congo, Yemen, and U.S. aid policy. Nevertheless, in 1966, Sadat became the highest-profile Egyptian since the revolution to visit the United States in an official capacity. This time, he hoped to persuade America to play the role of honest broker as Egypt was attempting to strike a deal with Saudi Arabia over Yemen. These were unemotional appeals founded on rational considerations of mutual interest. Had Sadat, as a top Egyptian official, signaled any kind of unusual friendliness, one of his American interlocutors would surely have noted it. Neither in his years as a government minister nor in his decade as the leader of the legislature was his attitude toward the United States deemed by American officials to be especially warm. At that point in time, Sadat had not yet developed visionary views on peace. He likely grasped, by the autumn of 1970, the practical futility of perennial war with Israel. Intermittent fighting was costly, and Egypt's treasury was already depleted. Air raids, threatening Cairo, stalled Egypt's economy. The conflict, putting Egypt at odds with the West, was precluding Egypt from operating in the wider international system. As a minister to Nasser, he had gravitated toward frameworks governed more by state sovereignty than by imperial hegemony or regional solidarity. And he understood the possibilities of neutrality as Nasser had not. But he had not fitted these pieces together into a coherent, long-term view of Egypt's future course, or of himself as its helmsman. Nor was there public evidence at the time of his potential to become a peacemaker. In fact, nearly all of his signals pointed the other way. Despite his contacts with the United States, he was its frequent and vehement critic, a tendency that persisted, at least in public, through the early years of his presidency. In his 1957 book Revolt on the Nile, he asserted that Israel had come into existence because the State Department dreamed of forcing its authority on the Islamic world, from the Caucasus to the Indian Ocean. And in 1970, he categorically rejected the possibility of recognizing Israel. Never. 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 This is something no one can decide. Our people here will crush anyone who would decide this. He treated Israel as a spearhead of American imperialism. Israel has been the first line of defense of American interests, and the Americans gave her the green light to the Gaza aggression. These voluble criticisms of the United States were enactments of his penchant for dramatic impact. Sadat believed that, in Egypt, personalities have always been more important than political programs. Early in his presidency, he summoned a top Soviet advisor for a dressing down. In the uniform of the supreme commander of the Egyptian armed forces, he warned the advisor, I am Stalin, not Kalinin, then the token president of the Soviet Union. If you don't carry out this order of mine, I'll treat you exactly as Stalin would have treated you. His manner of speaking was one of emphasis trending toward exuberance. He occasionally recounted confrontations and bold actions for which the underlying evidence was ambiguous. At times this made him appear more a rhetorician, operating on levels of drama and status, than a figure of political purposefulness. In the first 2 years of his presidency, opposition to the United States seemed to remain a central component of Sadat's policy. Thus, he contrasted the supposed benefits of Egypt's partnership with the Soviet Union to the miserliness of the West, which had refuse to supply us with one single pistol, even if we were to pay its price in foreign currency, or which had pretended to assist us and then reneged, hoping thereby to shake the confidence of our people in itself, in its dreams, and its revolutionary leadership. In early 1971, he would refer to proposals put forward by Golda Meir, then Israel's prime minister, as a pipe dream, based on the victory complex. Well into his presidency, Sadat was considered by American policymakers as a less dramatic version of Nasser. The corrective revolution. Charismatic leaders such as Gamal Abdel Nasser based their politics on casting a spell. Their inspirational rhetoric and demeanor are designed to smother the bleaker truths of everyday life. Stubborn realities come into focus only when the singular, blinding personality disappears. Such was the atmosphere in October 1970, after Nasser's death. Sadat, as vice president, took over the presidency as a transitional leader in accordance with the Egyptian constitution and subject to confirmation by the parliament. His inauguration was overshadowed by Nasser's funeral, as millions poured into the streets to pay their respects. The procession was so overwhelmed that Sadat feared the crowds might prevent Nasser's proper burial by taking his body away with them. Though he had spent nearly 2 decades in the upper echelons of national politics, his refusal to thrust himself into the limelight meant that Sadat was still not well known to the Egyptian people, and even less to the outside world. During his progression up the political ladder, Sadat had not been held in high regard in Washington. In December 1969, when he was named vice president, it was the common belief not only in the press but also in Washington and in our Cairo embassy that Sadat owed his promotion primarily to his being inconsequential and therefore in no position to threaten Nasser's leadership. In late September 1970, Nixon learned of Nasser's death and Sadat's automatic succession to the presidency while aboard an aircraft carrier, the USS Saratoga, in the Mediterranean. The shared instinct of most of those present, as well as of available intelligence reports, was that Sadat would not last long as president. He seemed to embody continuity with Nasser's aggressively nationalist ideology and, to boot, looked like a man of little influence or substance. One senior advisor gave him 6 weeks, the assessment being that his succession was just a convenient way of blocking selection of a stronger rival. Likewise, a CIA report from the time failed to include Sadat among the most important men around Nasser at the time of his death, and predicted that he was most unlikely to make a bid to take over permanently. Sadat's personal qualities contributed to his relative obscurity. Though he sometimes put on a show of assertiveness, as in his put-down of the Soviet advisor or his railings against America, these performances were to make a point. In reality, he was preternaturally calm. This attribute had somewhat insulated him from the pressures of ambition and the frenzy of political life. Over his 18 years in government, he had remained at a remove from the center of the maelstrom. He was one of the few members of the RCC initially not given a ministerial position. Sometimes this detachment was intentional. At least once, he had suspended his membership in the RCC because of his dislike of the posturing and infighting. The combination of his quietist personality and his friendship with Nasser had limited the usual incentives to develop a political base of his own, and he was never a natural politician. He spent more time in reflection, and in a way at prayer, than at the podium. His tendency toward solitude endowed him with insight and independent thought, but also marked him as a loner. Like the foreign observers, many Egyptian onlookers also believed that Sadat would be no more than a transitional leader. His colleagues on the RCC, particularly the powerful cluster headed by Ali Sabri, Sharawi Goma, Sami Sharif and General Mohammad Fawzi, perceived him as easy to control. 93. Sabri was a member of the Egyptian aristocracy and was considered a logical successor to Nasser by virtue of having served as his vice president, prime minister, and intelligence chief. Goma had been Nasser's Minister of Internal Affairs, Fawzi his defense minister, and Sharif a close presidential aide, indeed, his consigliere. At the start of his presidency, Sadat would retain these three, the last as a minister of state. To succeed formally, Sadat needed to be nominated for the presidency by the Executive Committee of the Arab Socialist Union, ASU, Egypt's only political party. That group, with the support of the influential Council of Ministers, agreed to give him the nod on October 7, 1970. They acquiesced in part because they could not agree on who among themselves could play Nasser's role, and because they judged Sadat too weak to challenge them. To ensure their control, they attached 5 conditions to his nomination, including a pledge to rule in tandem with the leaders of the ASU and the National Assembly, among them prominently the allies of Sabri and Goma. In effect, this cohort had given itself veto power over presidential policy. Sadat agreed, was nominated and duly elected. Despite the pitfalls of the late president's efforts toward Arab unity, the inadequate state of the military forces and the economic mismanagement that had withered both the private and public sector, Nasser remained a beloved icon of the Egyptian people. Those disappointed with the economic and political situation he left behind cast about for someone else to blame. It was on the new President Sadat that these burdens fell. To succeed a charismatic leader is in the best of circumstances a forbidding task. While policy can be transmitted, charisma is intangible. Capturing the imagination of the people, who were still mourning Nasser, was unlikely. And without control over the workings of his government, Sadat knew he would be a puppet. He needed, above all, to establish himself. Within 6 months of his election, he made a number of unilateral decisions that were at odds with the views of those seeking to exercise a veto over him. He abolished by decree the seizure and sequestration of private property, hinted at a peace gesture toward Israel, and declared an agreement of federation with Syria and Libya. Shocked by the new president's venture outside the bounds of their agreement, and threatened by a dilution of their power in the National Assembly, Sabri and Goma began plotting a military coup. Sadat discovered the plot and fired them. The conspirators then resigned as a group, hoping to instigate a constitutional crisis. But Sadat, aided by relationships in the assembly he had accumulated since 1952 and during his years as speaker, worked overnight to find replacements for each of the vacant positions in his newly reconstituted government. Instead of bending to his opponents' demands as expected, he swept them away in a single stroke, a move that would become known as the corrective revolution. Within 24 hours, he had imprisoned most of the plotters, 91 would ultimately face trial. Such decisiveness had not been evident in Sadat's earlier career, but it would become the hallmark of his presidency. Each of his bold and unexpected moves was deliberately calculated to serve a larger strategic objective. As one senior diplomat put it at the time, they badly misjudged the man if they thought he was going to be pliant. They forgot that he carried bombs in his pocket as a young revolutionary. Strategic patience. The corrective revolution consolidated Sadat's power and liberated him from his colleagues' control. But he was still tethered to Nasser's legacy and Egypt's realities, and constrained by two contradictory imperatives. To retain popular legitimacy, he would need to retain Nasserism and his link to Nasser's image. To reverse Egypt's fortunes, he would need to jettison many elements of Nasser's program. He therefore decided to reaffirm the Nasserist program while gradually, and at first imperceptibly, turning it in a new direction. By pursuing what looked like the established course, he would cloak his real intentions. In a speech to the National Assembly shortly after his nomination on October 7, Sadat announced that he would continue to pursue the path of Gamal Abdel Nasser whatever the case may be and from whatever position. Reaffirming Nasser's foreign policy, especially toward Israel, he would seek to free Arab lands from Israeli occupation, increase Arab unity, and safeguard, fully, the rights of the Palestinian people. Though domestic policy would play a large part in restoring Egypt's historic role, Sadat was convinced that his ability to resurrect a truly independent Egypt would depend in the end on his foreign policy. But when he entered the presidency, he gave no hint of a seminal foreign policy shift. As Nasser's successor and heir, he could not risk a dramatic dissociation, even if in the innermost parts of his mind he was considering it. Sadat's first move was to sign a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union in May 1971, a political step beyond Nasser's technically economic move of accepting Soviet aid for the Aswan Dam in 1956. In September of the same year, he also nodded to Nasser's pan-Arab legacy in following through on the formalities of a federation with Libya and Syria. Throughout, he kept up Nasser's usual barrage of criticism toward Israel and America. The principal party is, not Israel, but Israel's guardian, America. It conveys open defiance to us in everything, defiance to our existence, defiance to our dignity, our independence, our will, to every value we and the past generations fought to accomplish after the July 23 revolution. As with many of Sadat's moves, this last one had a dual purpose. It placated Soviet uneasiness over the dismissal and arrest of the pro-Soviet Ali Sabri at a time when Egypt still depended on the Soviets for military equipment. It also provided a means of testing whether the Soviet alliance could be exploited to induce the United States to pressure Israel for a Middle East settlement on the basis of Arab demands. At their summit in Khartoum in 1967, the Arab leaders had sworn never to recognize Israel, never to make peace with Israel, and never to negotiate with Israel. In his early years in office, Sadat's domestic position did not allow any deviation from the Khartoum rules. To that end, he now continued, and, if anything, made more explicit, the Nasserite attacks on Israel and the United States. In his speech to the National Assembly in 1972, he averred, "Armed colonialism of the brand we witness in Israel dislodges a people from their land. The means it uses to dislodge them is genocide and destitution." For its part, the United States, though powerful, mighty, and tyrannical, was nevertheless also impotent. Whatever his ambitions in his first year in office, Sadat limited himself to paths in foreign policy charted by his predecessor. such as dispatching UN diplomats to engage Israel indirectly in the negotiation of interim ceasefires along the Suez Canal. Yet, while operating under this guise of continuity, Sadat also embarked on gradual denasserization. Cautiously, he accelerated Egypt's transition toward capitalism. He also led the formation of a new constitution that, while retaining the basic institutional structure of strong presidential command laid down in the 1952 revolution, added a greater emphasis on democratic rights and greater lenience to religious groups, especially the Muslim Brothers, many of whom he released from prison. In foreign policy, from his intimate vantage point in Nasser's entourage and then his vice presidency, Sadat interpreted his predecessor's end as a lesson in the importance of appreciating limits. With the Suez closure, and given Egypt's involvements in the Arab world, Nasser had taken on tasks beyond his capacities and failed to see the value in incrementalism, including, or especially, in the pursuit of ideological objectives. These had incurred reputational, economic, and military costs, and also costs to Nasser's own flexibility by tying him up in impractical commitments and ideological rigidities. With these insights, Sadat initiated an early peace feeler to Israel too ambiguous for dramatic results. In February 1971, only 5 months after ascending to the presidency, he offered to reopen the Suez Canal if Israel would withdraw from the canal's immediate surroundings. This arguably marked a retreat from Egypt's and the Arab world's demand of full Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders. Israel interpreted this offer as a maneuver to compromise the Bar-Lev line, its set of fortified embankments along the eastern edge of the Suez Canal. It also objected to Sadat's indirect method of negotiation, involving UN officials as intermediaries, generally through a mediator designated by the UN Secretary-General. To keep channels open with Israel, Sadat went along with temporary ceasefire agreements along the Suez Canal and, even when they broke down, refrained from ordering a resumption of hostilities. Little more than a year later, in July 1972, Sadat's gradualism was replaced by a dramatic move: the abrupt expulsion from Egypt of roughly 20,000 Soviet advisors, without warning to Moscow or prior consultation with any Western country, including the United States, about either the move or its consequences. Though the full implications of this change in strategy took a while to reveal themselves, it would develop into a turning point in Middle East diplomacy. In retrospect, it appears that Sadat had given himself 2 years to determine whether Nasser's reliance on Moscow might produce tangible results. That is why, after the May 1971 signing of a friendship treaty between the Soviet Union and Egypt, Brezhnev began to urge Nixon to accelerate peace efforts in the Middle East. The overture from Brezhnev came during the concluding phases of the Vietnam War and before the 1972 summits in Beijing, February, and Moscow, May, which would redraw the global diplomatic map. With this in mind, the American response was what we also told the Middle East parties: that we were prepared to discuss principles of an eventual settlement, including at the Moscow summit. The start of a formal process would be based on progress in those talks. The strategy adopted at the beginning of the Nixon administration had involved creating for Egypt incentives to turn to American diplomacy. The Moscow summit had ended with a joint statement of principles including a shared commitment to maintain stability in the Middle East, which omitted any call for an immediate resumption of active negotiations. Coupled with the Soviet refusal to supply Sadat with arms at a level he considered adequate, this seems to have cemented Sadat's judgment that the Soviet partnership lacked utility. Every leading statesman I have encountered, with the possible exception of de Gaulle, would have implemented a new strategy incrementally, in stages that permitted measures of retreat if it proved ineffective. By contrast, Sadat made a radical departure that could be sustained only by forward movement. Tension between Egyptian and Soviet officials had been building for years. The spectacle of foreigners visiting indignities on Egyptians had, since childhood, struck a deep personal chord in Sadat. When in 1972 the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev demanded an explanation for the expulsion of Soviet advisors, Sadat wrote him, "You look on us as though we were a backward country, while our officers have had education in your academies." In his memoirs, Sadat reflects, "I wanted to tell the Russians that the will of Egypt was entirely Egyptian. I wanted to tell the whole world that we are always our own masters." Egypt would continue to accept Soviet economic aid, and the Soviets, intent on maintaining a modicum of influence, persisted in providing it. But Sadat had achieved his purpose of demonstrating that Egypt was capable of autonomous action, and not merely the vassal of a distant superpower. With the expulsion of Soviet personnel from Egypt, Sadat had removed a principal obstacle to American participation in a peace process. With Soviet influence waning, the diplomatic route via America appeared to be a natural path forward. But foreign policy is as influenced by intangibles as it is by objective circumstances. Sadat was still held in low regard in Washington. His initial public steps as president contradicted his private overtures, which were in any case too indirect and subtle to suggest a potential opening for transformative dialogue. My personal assessment had not improved materially from the time of his ascension to the presidency. In February 1973, as part of Sadat's early outreach, his national security advisor Hafiz Ismail visited Washington and invited me to Cairo, if our talks made progress. I scribbled a note to a colleague, "Would it be impolite to ask what the second prize is?" The outreach was unappealing on a number of levels. In light of Sadat's frequent anti-American statements in 1971 and 1972, Cairo did not appear a promising site for negotiation. Also, Hafiz Ismail's visit to Washington occurred barely a month after the Paris Agreement ending the Vietnam War. Around the same time, Nixon had promised Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir that another negotiation with Israel on a range of issues, so seemingly intractable, would not occur until after the forthcoming Israeli elections, then scheduled for late October. Sadat's apparent aim was to enlist the United States in producing a new Middle East arrangement on existing Arab terms, which began with the unconditional Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 frontiers, as a prelude to negotiations regarding recognition of Israel. The Soviets had failed to produce this result for Nasser, and a number of Arab leaders, who had not been able to achieve it by force, refused to seek it by dialogue. The fundamental challenge presented by the prevailing Arab-Israeli peace process was that both sides demanded an irrevocable concession as a condition for entering negotiations at all. The Arab countries required that Israel agree to return to the pre-war 1967 frontiers. Israel insisted on direct negotiations, which its adversaries refused on the grounds that this would constitute recognition. Despite these obstacles, Nixon did agree to an exploratory conversation with Hafiz Ismail. At the meeting, which took place on February 23, 1973, Ismail made explicit what Sadat's expulsion of the Soviets had implied, that Egypt was ready to normalize relations with the United States. Nixon affirmed his intention to explore that possibility in good faith, and ended by summarizing his understanding of the difficulties of the Middle East negotiation as the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. He suggested that a settlement would have to satisfy both the demand for Egyptian sovereignty and the imperative of Israeli security. Given what he called the gulf between the parties, however, he felt it would be prudent to pursue a step-by-step approach, seeking interim and partial solutions, rather than attempt a comprehensive resolution, though without categorically foreclosing the latter as an option. As had become standard operating procedure, Nixon stressed that the actual negotiation should be conducted through the Security Advisor's office, and that Ismail and I should start the exploratory phase immediately, and indeed our discussions began the following day. To permit extended conversations and to emphasize their informal, confidential character, they took place at a private home in a New York suburb. In our talks, Hafiz Ismail repeated what he had already told Nixon, that Egypt was tired of the "no war, no peace" situation and that Sadat was prepared to re-establish diplomatic relations with the United States. He urged the United States to participate actively in the peace process, deviating from established Arab terms only by implying a readiness to explore a separate peace on the basis of total Israeli withdrawal. Sticking to Nixon's suggested step-by-step approach, I outlined some details as to how it might work. It was, I pointed out, a significant departure from the methods that had characterized Middle East diplomacy heretofore. The prevailing approach to Middle East peace was comprehensive, involving the resolution of all contested borders between Israel and its neighbors as well as the Palestinian Arabs. It also envisioned an encompassing peace conference including the major regional players, together with Palestinian representatives, with the United States and the Soviet Union participating as great power facilitators, as well as guarantors of the projected agreement. A step-by-step approach, by contrast, would seek to disaggregate the Israel-Palestinian dispute from the possibility of regional progress on particular issues. Some of these issues were related to sovereignty, jurisdictional and administrative arrangements, normalization of relations and ultimately mutual recognition, while others were related to security, creating non-proliferation regimes, countering terrorist networks and ensuring the free flow of energy resources. Taking steps forward on such practical issues, rather than tying them to the ultimate resolution of an importantly psychological and historic problem, could create an organic momentum by enabling those regional players, who had the greatest interest in the resolution of the individual issues to sustain the outcome. The conversations with Ismail were inconclusive in terms of immediate decisions, in large part because at that time, the spring of 1973, a step-by-step approach was altogether precluded by inter-Arab agreements. Nevertheless, I outlined to Ismail how steps might be taken, for example, by separating Egyptian and Israeli sovereignty criteria from accommodations on mutual security concerns. Ismail did not receive a program from us embracing his stated goals, but he did receive a detailed and accurate picture of our proposed alternative, which, in the end, Sadat would accept. That was in February. In the fall, on October 6, to be precise, Sadat decided, before returning to diplomacy, to deliver a shock that altered every country's perceptions of him. The 1973 War. As early as July 1971, at a session of the Arab Socialist Union Congress, Sadat had declared that he would not accept this state of no war and no peace. He had identified the problem, stasis with Israel, but it is unlikely that, so early in his presidency, he had made any decision about how to solve it. Rather, he was still exploring various ways of improving his negotiating position. It was not until sometime in 1972 that he decided to alter his strategy, but, at that time, he could not move toward a step-by-step approach in the Arab world and retain minimal support from the Soviet Union without some dramatic act. that established his own authenticity. Sadat decided to go to war. He may have hoped to achieve his stated objectives in one fell swoop. Much more likely, he was initiating hostilities in the expectation that it might legitimize alternative diplomatic options. Jahan Sadat, his extraordinary wife, recalled that he described the situation to her as requiring one more war in order to win and enter into negotiations from a position of equality. The White House discussions in 1973 with Ismail confirmed for Sadat the U.S. willingness to become involved, and also its limits. They convinced him that, failing total Egyptian victory, the step-by-step approach might provide a fallback position. For more than a year, Sadat prepared for the right constellation of forces to achieve a real peace. That period was described in August 1972 by the Egyptian journalist Mohammed Hakel as a constant hemorrhage for Egypt, a death without heroism that is on the point of suffocating the country. Jahan Sadat remembered of the period. Egyptian soldiers and freedom fighters continued to be killed in the sporadic fighting along the Suez Canal. The windows of all the houses and the headlights of all the cars in the canal zone continued to be painted dark blue, to stop any lights from showing during air raids. In Cairo, sandbags were still piled in front of buildings, while the windows on museums and stores were taped to minimize damage from bombs. The atmosphere was very depressing during this time that the historians were to call no war, no peace. We all hated it and wanted it to end. Especially Anwar. Determined to wait until the situation had evolved, so that his war would be the last war, Sadat made careful preparations. In mid-1972, after the expulsion of Soviet advisors, Sadat ordered military plans to be drawn up. In October 1972, when he inquired into progress, he discovered that his generals, perhaps disbelieving the prospects, had failed even to begin the task. After firing the war minister, Sadat set aside additional funds and purchased more weapons from the Soviets. He also secretly elaborated a joint war plan with Syrian President Hafez al-Assad. As he primed his own military, Sadat confounded Israel's. Through the spring and summer of 1973, Sadat goaded the Israelis with threats of action, then duped them into readying for assault. Twice, the Israel Defense Forces mobilized at great expense. Twice, they realized the alarms had been false. On 6 separate occasions, Egypt performed apparently routine military exercises resembling a real operation. On the day prior to the actual invasion, Soviet planes in the process of evacuating the USSR's diplomats, a gesture which should have alerted the Israelis and the United States, were misinterpreted to be part of Soviet training. After the 1973 war, Israel's then defense minister, Moshe Dayan, replying to the question of why he had not mobilized in October, would answer that Sadat made me do it twice, at a cost of $10 million each time. So, when it was the third time around, I thought he wasn't serious. But he tricked me. By the fall of 1973, Sadat had spent nearly 18 months shaping the international landscape for an impending war. Public flexibility on transit of the canal had burnished his international reputation. Expelling the Soviets had increased his diplomatic options and ensured that the advisors would neither prevent nor subvert his plans. Exploratory conversations with the White House implied that he entered the war with a working relationship with Washington. He must have calculated that the United States would help to limit the consequences of a military setback and might enter negotiations. Based on considerations such as these, on October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated offensive against Israel. Sadat had already called on the Egyptian people, in January 1972, to prepare for confrontation, and to embrace an ethic of forbearance. We have ahead of us many hardships and difficulties. But with God's help we will bear its burdens and sacrifices. Our people will give, in the battle, the living example that they are a great people like their history, their long civilization and their humanity and ideals. Our Lord, make our faith the best and be with us until victory. On the first day of the war, Sadat communicated to me, then Secretary of State, that his aims were limited and he intended efforts to facilitate negotiations for peace after hostilities had ended. On the war's second day, I replied, "You're making war with Soviet arms. Keep in mind that you will have to make peace with American diplomacy." Managing to achieve the kind of military success that had eluded Nasser, Egyptian forces laid down pontoon bridges across the Suez Canal and crossed the Bar-Lev line. They advanced up to 10 miles into the Sinai, retaking territory that had been captured by Israel in 1967. At the same time, Syrian forces penetrated Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. As the two Arab forces pressed onward, equipped largely with Soviet arms, Israel suffered significant casualties and losses of equipment. The early Egyptian-Syrian success stunned the world, confronting all sides with unexpected situations. Paradoxically, however, once the war was fully underway, the UN Security Council, which had the responsibility for preserving peace, shrank from proposing a ceasefire. Of the Council's two most powerful members, the Soviet Union was opposed because it did not want to impede the perceived Arab advance, while the United States was reluctant lest it prevent an Israeli counterstrike. The other members were undecided out of a mixture of fear and uncertainty. In the event, the Security Council would not meet to vote on a ceasefire until the United States and the Soviet Union had agreed on a text, on October 22, more than 2 weeks after the war's outbreak. During these weeks, Nixon's domestic crisis came to a head. On the same day as the outbreak of the 1973 war, Vice President Spiro Agnew began the process of his resignation as the result of activities conducted while he was serving as Governor of Maryland, 1967-9. This was concluded on October 10, coinciding with another wave of Watergate hearings on the issue of which of Nixon's taped conversations should be released. Nixon's efforts to avoid releasing these tapes would culminate on October 20, 2 weeks into the Middle East War, and while I was in Moscow negotiating a ceasefire, when Nixon requested the resignation of and dismissed the Attorney General and the Special Prosecutor, respectively. The resulting uproar led to the initiation of impeachment proceedings against Nixon. Despite his domestic difficulties, Nixon maintained his control of foreign affairs. Early on during the war, he established two primary objectives: to end the hostilities as quickly as possible and, as I said publicly on his behalf, to do so in a manner that would enable us to make a major contribution to removing the conditions that had produced 4 wars between Arabs and Israelis in the previous 25 years. On the ground, the situation was changing almost daily. By Tuesday, October 9, the 4th day of the war and the day Spiro Agnew's formal resignation as vice president was dealt with by Nixon, the Israeli ambassador Simcha Dinitz and the military attaché General Mordecai Ger appeared in the map room of the White House residence to inform me that Israel had lost hundreds of tanks and many tens of airplanes in the initial battles along the Suez Canal. They requested immediate resupply and a visit to Washington by Prime Minister Mayer to plead her case. After concluding the Agnew resignation, Nixon agreed to respond to the immediate needs with some emergency support. he directed an immediate resupply of 3 airplanes a day, and an evaluation of the feasibility of mobilizing our civilian air fleet. To enable Israel to use its backup weapons, Nixon promised to replace all losses after the war. On Thursday, October 11, Deinitz reappeared at the White House with another dramatic message. The Israeli Chief of Staff, David Elazar, and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan had convinced the Prime Minister that further Israeli attacks along the Suez Canal were too costly, in the face of the belt of surface-to-air missiles, SAM, on the canal's west bank to provide air cover for the territory 15 to 20 miles east of the canal. Israel was therefore prepared to accept a ceasefire and was asking us to arrange it. To improve its bargaining position, Israel would open an offensive on the more vulnerable Syrian front, thereby giving an incentive for the Soviet Union to support a ceasefire request in the Security Council. Nixon agreed, and we approached Britain to introduce such a resolution. The British government, represented by Sir Alec Douglas-Home as Foreign Secretary, undertook the initiative. But Sadat, when asked to assent on Saturday, October 13, amazed us by refusing unless Israel committed itself to return to the pre-June 1967 frontiers. Another approach to him via Australia met the same fate. By Sunday, October 14, Sadat's motives for these refusals became apparent. He had decided to lunge more deeply into Sinai with 2 armored divisions. Whether impelled by overconfidence in his military capacity after the crossing of the canal, or by a desire to relieve the pressures on his ally Assad, or by a brief loss of his sense of proportion, venturing beyond the territory covered by the SAM belt resulted in a disastrous setback. Between the Israeli Air Force, now freed from the SAM belt's restraints, and counterattacks by Israeli tanks, some 250 of Egypt's tanks were wiped out. This in turn enabled Israeli tanks to push the Egyptian Third Army back toward the canal. Within 2 days of that battle, in heavy fighting, Israeli forces had made a canal crossing of their own and started to destroy the Soviet-built SAM sites on the canal's west bank. Meanwhile, armored Israeli forces, growing to over 10,000 strong, thrust to the rear of the Third Army, threatening its encirclement and even Cairo. In these circumstances, General Saad Shazli, the Egyptian field commander, urged Sadat to transfer the Third Army from the canal's east bank to its west bank so as to protect Egypt's population. But this would have defeated Sadat's larger design. He responded sharply, "You do not understand the logic of this war," and ordered Shazli to stand fast. Egypt needed only 4 inches of the Sinai, Sadat argued, in order to transform the diplomatic situation. On Thursday, October 18, with 2 Egyptian divisions withdrawing in the Sinai, Sadat suddenly called for a ceasefire. The tide of battle having turned against him, he needed a pause while he still retained a foothold in the Sinai. Even as he appealed for the ceasefire, he claimed a psychological victory. The enemy lost his balance and remains unbalanced until this moment. The wounded nation has restored its honor, and the political map of the Middle East has been changed. In the same speech, he urged the United States to join with Egypt in a project for peace. However dire Sadat's military situation, his analysis of policy options remained on the mark. The crisis spread into the global economy on October 17, when the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced an oil embargo, aiming to oblige the U.S. and its European allies to push Israel into a settlement. The price of a barrel of oil rose precipitously, eventually reaching 400% of its pre-crisis level. The next day, Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and I began to discuss ceasefire language for possible joint submission to the Security Council. On October 19, Brezhnev invited me to Moscow to complete the ceasefire negotiations, and 2 days later the US and the Soviet Union presented a joint draft to the Security Council that, on October 22, was adopted unanimously. The turn toward a cessation of hostilities was temporarily overwhelmed when the ceasefire broke down and Israel could not